Welcome to the Transforming Basketball podcast. Really pleased to be joined today by Philip O'Callaghan. You might have come across Philip on social media, especially Twitter. Philip has been doing an incredible job over the last couple of years, sharing contemporary skill acquisition ideas for coaches. And I connected with Philip for the first time. I think it was about 8 months ago, Philip, when you did an amazing online masterclass session. And it's just, I think the way that Philip breaks down these ideas, it can really help us as a basketball community really get to grips with ecological dynamics and the constraints of that approach. So, Philip, thanks so much for joining us today.
It should be a good chat, hopefully. Excited to talk anyway.
Absolutely. So, the first question I had for you, Philip, is, with transforming basketball, one of the key kind of ways we start explaining these ideas is how learning is a non-linear process. And it's not this kind of linearized view that we've always believed as coaches. Would you be able to just talk about that a little bit? Because I think it's a really nice entry point into our discussion today.
Yeah, I suppose like when we talk about non-linear, there's kind of two aspects to it. So the first thing is like when we talk about like say human, so what that would mean is like one like I suppose aspect of a non-linear system is that like changes would be non-proportionate, and that might sound a bit complicated, but basically it just means like small changes can lead to big changes, or big changes can lead to small changes, and like in say like a small change in the conditions can lead to a big change in the human system, or like a small change in or a big change in conditions can lead to a small change. So when we talk about like non-linear, it can refer to like the humans as non-linear systems, and then we can also I suppose look at learning as non-linear, where because humans are non-linear systems, that like learning doesn't follow like a straight line progression or whatever. There's going to be regressions, like quite fast progressions and things like that. So that's I suppose when we talk about non-linear pedagogy, it's going to talk about humans as non-linear systems, and then we can talk about the learning process as being non-linear too.
I think that's really nicely put. So I think practically for coaches, what we see a lot of within the basketball world would be a linearistic outlook where we, use the same things for all players, whether that's teaching techniques or even patterns and like offenses. And then kind of we expect them all to make progress at the same rate, or we expect it to kind of all lead to development in this very kind of gradual curve. Whereas exactly like you said, sudden regressions are normal, but also, when we're manipulating constraints for one player, it could maybe really help them express more functionality and, maybe becoming more attuned to their affordance landscape. Whereas maybe for another player, it might be different. So, does that mean that as coaches, we've really got to look at how we can, individualize kind of our practice environments more than this generic one size fits all?
Yeah, definitely. And like I suppose I've kind of two extremes. So like I'm a PE teacher and a tennis coach. So if I like in a PE class, it can be really, really difficult if I wanted to
Yeah.
individualize it for 30 students. But in a tennis practice, I might have one or two. So it's a bit easier. So like I can understand how coaches might, I suppose, have some challenges around it. But yeah, like I suppose what's very important for coaches to understand is like that every human or every kind of problem, every human is going to be different. We talk about like constraints. So like the constraints that are acting on a human are going to like be different. So some people are going to be taller, some people are going to be smaller, some people are going to be fast, some people are going to be slow. So that's going to influence how I suppose they see the world and see the opportunities, or as we kind of you mentioned, their affordances. So it'll influence how they can pick up affordances, what ones are kind of more inviting for them. So then if I suppose we try to put all the players to like I suppose move in a certain way or to perform in a certain way, it won't work because like their action capabilities, sometimes we might refer to them, are going to be different. So then what the information that they're going to be looking for is going to be different too.
Love that. That was excellently put. So this is a really interesting one, and something I'm constantly wrestling with, Philip. And it's like, where if we were with a coach who was first being introduced to, a whole new world of coaching and these ideas that we're speaking about today, where would you start explaining it? Because we've obviously got ecological dynamics as the base theoretical framework. Then kind of we've spoken about it a little bit, and we'll get more into it. We've got a nonlinear pedagogy, and then that obviously informs the constraint-led approach. So where, it's very difficult to describe those three things and make sense of it. And we're going to get into that today, but where would we even start?
Yeah, I think even just being aware of those three things is really important, because to be honest, when I first got started with the approach, I only really heard about the constraints and the constraints-led approach. I didn't know that about ecological dynamics or nonlinear pedagogy. So even knowing about that is a great start. What it is something that I'm trying to build a kind of resource for coaches at the moment, getting started with the constraints-led approach. And I don't know, every time I see something, it's nearly like I'm wondering where coaches should get started with. I suppose what I've personally found myself, and I'm not sure if this would have applied to you too, but I think what had the biggest impact on me and my coaching and applying the, say, constraints-led approach was understanding nonlinear pedagogy. And having, what I found really nice was having, like, say, there's 5 key principles, and then we can maybe put in task simplification and principles of play or something in there as well. But having those 5 principles is kind of like a framework to design your practices off, I found personally really helpful in applying it. Because I suppose, like, for coaches that mightn't be aware of it, like, there's 5 key principles. I suppose the most important one is probably manipulation of constraints. Because that's how you would, I suppose, design representative learning environments. That's how you'd create tasks that keep information moving coupled. But I suppose that's the first one, constraints. Then I'd probably say the second one then that would be important for coaches would be representative learning design. Then we'd have attentional focus, we'd have information movement coupling, and functional variability. Yeah, repetition without repetition, or functional variability. So I personally found that once I had a grasp of those, that I started to apply the constraints-led approach better. But that's my personal view anyway.
I agree completely, because it was actually the same for me, Philip. When I first kind of discovered this, I started with the CLA, but I'd say I didn't feel really confident and I didn't feel like I was good at it until I understood those 5 design principles. Because then obviously, like you just alluded to, if you're following those 5 principles, well, you're going to be using a CLA intentionally and purposefully. And then I just think, the understanding of ecological dynamics, it's kind of like, it just connects the dots even more. And it kind of, makes sense why we're doing this and why it makes sense. I think that's actually what you had in one of your diagrams. You had a really nice infographic. I think I'm going to try and find it and post with this podcast, where you kind of, I think you kind of explain just how they kind of inform each other, basically. Yeah.
So, like, I would say why, like, understanding ecological dynamics is going to, like, I suppose, take your understanding of how to apply the approach to the next level. But just if you were, like, looking to get started straight away, I'd probably start looking at some of the ideas behind nonlinear pedagogy first, because, like, there is a lot of reading to it, but I do think those are like show how, like, compare nonlinear versus linear approach, and you can kind of maybe get some ideas from that. So I suppose that is where I personally would start.
Definitely. So I think that's actually a nice kind of opportunity for us to go a little bit deeper into nonlinear pedagogy, because just reflecting on some of the podcasts and the resources we released through Transforming, I think we've neglected it a little bit, and I think this is a great chance to really help coaches and practitioners understand it. So maybe we could just go a little bit deeper into some of the design principles, Philip. I mean, maybe in the context of basketball, looking at something like representative learning design, traditionally we see a lot of equipment activities around defense. What does that mean for coaches?
Basketball is actually quite an interesting one, because there's some nice studies done using representative learning design in basketball. But I suppose if I'm looking at representative learning design, like, what we really what we're looking to, I suppose, represent in practice is, like, the key affordances, or the key information, or the key opportunities for action. From the I suppose, competition or from the game environment or performance environment. And we want to kind of create those same opportunities for action or affordances in the practice task. I suppose a misconception sometimes I see is that like it needs to be fully
Yeah.
representative or it needs
And
to
I
be
see
like
that a
hyper
lot. And it's
representative. Yeah,
impossible. You can't
it is
always have five
impossible.
on five. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I think one of the nicest ways to apply representative learning design down is through task simplification, or a really nice phrase I've heard before. It's from Cal Jones. He stole it from someone, he doesn't know who, and I'd love to know so I could reference it, but it's reduce without impoverishing. So we reduce the complexity without impoverishing the key information or the key opportunities for action. So I suppose if you're a coach looking to use representative learning design, a way you could do it is kind of like think of a scale or think of like a continuum or something, that like one might be a task where there's none of the key information present, maybe like dribbling around a cone, for example, and 10 would be full 5-on-5 game. A lot of the time what we do is we kind of look to be is probably where a lot of the practice should be, and then you could kind of be a bit more complex, a bit less complex, depending on the needs of practice. And what we do is like we create I suppose slices of the game is a nice way. I've heard it before. I like to think of it as like creating a live slices of the game. So like it's kind of combining. There's two really nice papers that came out, I suppose, recently. One by Sean Mishka, Tyler Yeary, Keith Davids, I think, where like one was around the American football and one was about like designing a live problem. So like combining those two ideas together, I think is quite nice, creating a live slices.
I love that. So many golden nuggets in there, Flip.
Yeah.
If it's cool, I'd love to just spend a minute. I want to just break down some of those things in basketball language, and then maybe you can build on it after, and then we can go back to the next design principle. So coaches listening, just to recap affordances, so opportunities for action. So let's imagine that maybe there's an offensive player standing in the left corner and a teammate from anywhere has done a drive and kick and they've passed them the ball and it's a closeout situation. So all we mean by affordances are what are the different invitations for action in this situation now. So maybe, the player might perceive information and they choose to drive it along the baseline with the intent to try and score a rim finish. As that happens, new affordances may emerge. So for instance, maybe another help defender might come across, opening the invitation to pass. Maybe no help defender comes across, the invitation to finish exists. So, the whole game of basketball is obviously, these affordances are ever present and the affordance landscape is constantly changing. So with this concept of representative learning design, it's a case of, how can we as coaches design in some of these affordances into the game? And that's where, as Philip, you just spoke about, it's a representative dial. And just playing 5-on-5 isn't good enough because we're not going to amplify these affordances enough, where, going a little bit low on that dial, maybe some one-on-one, some one-on-one plus one, some two-on-one, two-on-two, we're amplifying affordances even more. Would that be correct, Philip?
Yeah, no, definitely. So like, I suppose if you're a coach listening, you mightn't really have heard of affordances before. Like as you said, they're kind of opportunities for action, and it's not like, I suppose they're kind of perceived or they're picked up in like relation to what the person can do, their action capability. So like, and it would, like, a lot of it would be like, I suppose, if you got the basket, I know a lot of it you can just like add ability to the end. So like the shoot ability of the shot or the dribble ability or the pass ability. So like people with different action capabilities are going to pick up different opportunities for action. So I suppose like if you're someone that is a very competent 3-point shooter and you get the ball and you're open, you're probably going to take a shot. Whereas if you're not confident and you're maybe a bigger player who likes to get to the basket, you're going to look for the opportunity to drive instead of shoot. So the affordances are kind of based on that I suppose specific individuals' action capabilities. And then I suppose why we wouldn't want just 5-against-5 games, because if you look at that situation where that you described, where someone gets a kickback pass, and that's a situation that player is struggling in, that might only happen once in a 5-on-5 game in an hour. Whereas
That's
what we want
exactly
to
it. Yeah.
what we want to do is we want to give them that opportunity, like way more through our design of practice tasks, so they get better at picking up the key information that will help them make better decisions in that scenario. So that's kind of why just playing the game or something like that isn't kind of what we'd do, and we'd scale the task back, or we'd simplify it but keep the key information.
That was fantastic. I love how you built on that point, because I think that was such an important point you raised, Philip, that I neglected to, highlight how players perceive affordances in different ways. So going back to the closeout example I gave, maybe it's Steph Curry, Nikola Jokic, Giannis Antetokounmpo. They're all going to act very differently in that situation because they're all unique individuals and they're perceiving affordances differently too. So I think that's a really nice dive into representative learning design for coaches. And I think naturally, Philip, if coaches kind of abide by some of these design principles, they sometimes get some of the other ones too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, we might cross back to some of these as we go on, but maybe let's go on to relevant information movement couplings.
Yeah. So I suppose, like, if we're looking at that, it's that, like, the players are learning to couple, or to, like, couple their key, that was the key information in the environment. So, like, I suppose, like, if we go back to that closeout example, if the player that's being closed out will have to learn how to, I suppose, couple their movements to the information that the defender is giving them. So, like,
Yeah.
what foot does he have forward? Does that let me dribble? Or would it be better if I dribble? Did he close at an angle so I can so there's a pass open that way, something like that. So, like,
Yeah.
they're learning to, I suppose, move based on the key information that they would be seeing in a game. So rather than, I suppose, they get the ball and at the cone they need to stop, that they're actually, like, I suppose, picking up information from a player, because that's what they're going to be doing in a game.
Fantastic. Great stuff. So manipulation of constraints. I think this is a really important one, Philip, because we're seeing a lot of games approach activities in the basketball world. And I think this is kind of one of those design principles which can help coaches naturally just move towards a CLA instead.
Like, the manipulation of constraints is probably the most important principle, because it allows you to do the other ones more effectively. So to design a representative learning task, we manipulate the constraints of the task, such as, like, where the player's starting position, things like that. So the task becomes representative. We can also manipulate the constraints to design tasks that keep information and movement coupled. So, like, I suppose that's how you'd implement the constraints-led approach, through manipulating constraints, and then those are I suppose, the other design principles then follow along from how, and they'll guide how you manipulate those constraints. So I'm not sure if you want to get into the different type of constraints or anything like that, but
that would be great for them. And then after that, I think the closeout example we've got is a really nice one. So then I think once you've touched on that, then we can just go back and we can both give some practical examples of how we can manipulate in this closeout situation.
yeah. So for coaches that are interested in learning, I suppose, about the different types of constraints, it actually came from, like, a researcher called Carl Newell. So it's called Newell's constraints triangle. So basically there's three categories of constraints. There's individual, which can be divided into structural and functional. So, like, the individual constraints are like the constraint, like a functional or structural constraints would be like someone's height, someone's weight, someone's strength, they're not really ones we can manipulate very easily, or we'd have to manipulate them on, I suppose, a macro level. So, like, someone's strength, it would take a few weeks to improve. It's not something. Then, like, the functional individual constraints, some of them we can manipulate. So it would be like someone's motivation level, someone's what other, like, someone picking up information, things like that.
Yeah.
While some of them are harder to manipulate, is some we can. So, like, their emotional state, their motivation levels, things like that, we have a bit of impact on. So while, like, we can't manipulate them that much, it's very important for coaches to be aware of. Especially, like, a nice example is, like, if you were a coach that was working with a player that was growing, you know that's actually going to have a big effect on the way they can move, because they're going through a growth spurt. Their coordination might be a bit all over the place. They're learning to move in their body. So we know that I suppose individual constraint might have a big impact on the way they're playing. Then if we look at the environment constraints, I suppose some of these coaches can manipulate, especially if you have a big budget and you can fly a place or have lots of a nice practice facility. But for everyday coaches, maybe not as much. So like it could be the structure, or it could be like the environment you're in, the light levels, the weather, the temperature, things like that are going to be environmental constraints. So I suppose like if you were a wealthy, or if you were a part of a wealthy organization, you might go on warm weather training. That would be an environmental constraint. Or like in tennis, you would play on different surfaces, things like that. So that would be an environmental constraint. And again, really important to understand. And those environmental constraints can also be, I suppose, can be shaped by the culture. So, or the socio-culture. We call it socio-cultural, but it's basically just a culture. So like a really good example is how like Brazilian soccer prioritizes flair. I think there might be in basketball, I suppose they're like New York street basketball, or like street basketball, or like European players play in it. They're generally, I don't know if I'm right here, but they, or maybe or something like that. So that would be like a socio-cultural constraint, and they're also ones that coaches need to be really aware of. And then getting to the task constraints, this is where I suppose we have more power to manipulate constraints. So we can, I suppose some of the task constraints are going to be the rules of the game. So like in basketball, you have to dribble a ball. That's going to constrain the way you move. You can't like run with it. You need to dribble. You have 24 seconds to score. The height of the basket, things like that. They're all going to affect the way a player plays. And then in practice, there's some of them we can manipulate or change to design our tasks. So sorry, I know that was kind of long, but hopefully that was
brilliant.
Of value.
No, that was absolutely brilliant, Philip. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take everything you just outlined for us, and I want to create a basketball specific example with the closeout, and then maybe you could build on that based on what I miss, if that's cool. So coaches, we've got now we're thinking about, we've got these three principles of nonlinear pedagogy. So recap: representative learning design, relevant information movement couplings, and the third one we just had manipulation of constraints. So we've got to create an activity where there are affordances for a closeout. So we've got to think, how could we start the offense and the defense where this affordance appears? So let me take a really simple one. We're going to have an offensive player in the corner. We're going to have a defender who is blind to them, maybe standing in the mid-range area. And then we're going to have a passer under the basket. So the passer, they're going to just rebound the ball, throw it off the backboard catch. As soon as that happens, the offensive player the task constraint is constrained. The space is constrained, so they can only move between the deep corner and the wing, but they have to catch it outside the three. The pass goes and it's a live one-on-one. The defender can move on the pass. So that's a really simple starting point. Now, this is the key difference, coaches. If we stay on that activity for an excessive period of time, which is something I'm seeing a lot now, it's a games approach. And we've got to think, why are we manipulating constraints? We're doing it for a very specific reason. So, maybe there are affordances we want to amplify, or maybe different movement solutions we want to encourage players to maybe explore in a more unique way. So some ways we could change constraints. So respecting the role of individual constraints, frequently changing the offensive, the defensive players, and even the passers. Why? Well, Philip spoke about action capabilities. Players move in different ways. So obviously playing against a much taller defender is going to be very different to a smaller defender, quicker versus slow, bigger versus weaker. So by constantly mixing up these pairings, different solutions are going to emerge. So that can be individual constraints. Environment constraints. Maybe we're playing loud music in the gym, so there's not much of an opportunity to communicate. Maybe we're blasting crowd sounds, which is something I do a lot with my teams. Really simple example. Then the task constraints, obviously loads we could do here. We could change the location of the pass so it's always variable. We create more repetition out repetition as opposed to always starting under the basket. We could change the space where the offensive player starts. Maybe some players struggle with traveling on the closeout when they move. and when they receive the ball, they travel. So maybe they begin with some type of drift or lift before the closeout. Maybe they do it off another trigger. And this is where we can really individualize it. And, you know, the opportunities obviously are almost endless when we're manipulating these constraints. Philip, I hope I did a good enough job there, just, you know, putting it into this example.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, like definitely. So like as you like alluded to there, I suppose like because there's so many constraints there, like the amount of freedom the coach has to be creative is quite is nice. I really enjoy like the challenge of creating tasks or
It's the
trying to
best
like
thing.
make them challenging. And I suppose and yeah, I really enjoy it. And I suppose one important thing I'd kind of add is that like say if the player we were to close out and say we wanted to work on their shooting when they were getting closed out or whatever. An important thing is that like we're constraining to afford it is a really important concept when we're using constraints. So when I first started with the constraint set approach or using constraints, because I actually wasn't using the constraint set approach, I was just using constraints,
Oh,
was I'd be like, okay, if he's struggling with shooting, when he gets the ball, he has to shoot. So then the defender knows he has to shoot. So they can adjust their behavior. So what I do instead now is that like in that situation, I'd reward the player for shooting, but I'd also keep the option open for them to dribble past the defender and maybe go towards the basket because
yep.
they need to learn when to shoot, when to dribble, when to pass. So we want to keep those options open for them, but reward them for taking the ones that we want to work on. So we might give them maybe 5 points if they get the shot, and we'd give them just 2 points if they get to the basket. So we
Fantastic.
really are encouraging that option. We're rewarding them for going for it, but we still want to keep the other options open.
I love that. And I think in addition, that's such a great point because I'm seeing a lot of these contested shooting games, Philip, one-on-ones in the basketball world. And I think small doses of that can be good
Yeah.
because it's, you know, it's like we're really kind of, you know, pushing adaptability. But then at the same time, like you just said, it's not conducive if we're doing that excessively, which is a common trend. So I think obviously using points is key. And then I'm just imagining this closeout situation, you know, we've added the scoring system. I think having some element of the time pressure is key because obviously if we're really talking about representative learning design, a closeout situation, it's only, you know, if we lose the advantage, we're back to 5-on-5 and the advantage lost. It's gone.
Yeah.
So maybe we play with like a 3 or 4 second shot clock and maybe the space is limited so they don't go into spacings which will be occupied by other players. You know, maybe there's like a small rectangle or maybe another defender's there stunting. So, you know, it's obviously more representative because they're playing in the space that will exist within the game.
Yeah, definitely. So like we want to kind of keep, I suppose, like something that's quite important when you're doing these tasks is like there's some sort of consequence present. And like we don't mean consequence like, oh, if they miss, they have to do 50 push-ups or something. It's more like if they don't take advantage of that opportunity, there's going to be another defender there and they're going to lose the ball or something like that. So like a consequence like is that if they lose the ball, the defenders can do something, or if they don't use the advantage, then they're going to lose it and they're way more likely to be successful. So when we talk about tasks having consequences, that's what we mean by
Yeah,
consequences. We're
exactly.
not, yeah,
20 push-ups.
yeah, yeah,
And I think it's great because naturally, obviously, we focused, you know, a lot of coaches will be thinking about this example and focus on the offense. But then what we see a lot traditionally in the closeout defense, Philip, is coaches doing very kind of dead drills where, you know, they have coaches, the ball is passed, and players have to close out, high hands, choppy steps to the coaches,
I
and
can
then
imagine Coach
nothing
Carter.
happens.
What is it?
Exactly, right? Coach Carter,
Yeah,
indeed.
yeah,
No. And obviously, you know, that's not what any of the things Philip and I have spoken about today, coaches. So instead, you know, what we're getting at with here is we don't have to have offensive and defensive drills. When we're using a nonlinear pedagogy and we're following these 5 design principles, you know, we are getting offense and defense at the same time. And we can construct, you know, we can think about point systems for the defense. So maybe if they negate the advantage and they, you know, they get back to neutral, maybe it's over and they get extra points. There's so much we can do within this.
yeah,
So
definitely.
so Philip, I want to get to the last 2, and this is a killer episode. I think we're covering so many topics. Let's have a look at functional variability.
Yeah, so I suppose like when we're, from the way we look at skilled performance or like skill learning, is that like variability is an important part of it, and it's actually like something we want there rather than something to be avoided. So like we're not like striving to get the textbook shooting technique. We're looking for a shooting technique that gets the outcome we want, and they can adapt their technique to get the right outcome. So like even though it might look like the best shooters shoot the same every time, they're going to have to make different subtle adaptations to their shot to make sure that they're making it. So when we talk about using functional variability in practice, it's that we encourage the athletes to, I suppose, solve the problem in a number of different ways. And also we set up the problem so they are required to solve the problem in different ways. So like in the closeout example, the defender might be starting in a slightly different position every time. The attacker gets the ball in a different corner maybe, or they get it at a different zone in the area that they're closing in. They might get the ball, like they might have to start sideways with the ball, and they have to work to get their body, something like that. So like I kind of look, if I'm designing a task, I try to alter either the starting position of the defender or the attacker every time, maybe where the pass is coming from, things like that. So that's what we're talking about when we're using functional variability. Like the name of it is repetition without repetition. So we don't want to repeat after repetition, which is like just rote repetition. We want to repeat the process of solving the problem using different solutions.
I loved how you spoke about just different movements before. Something I've loved trying is having this closeout situation off a drive and kick, and then you actually have the offense starting in a quote unquote bad spacing location. So they've got to find a way to get to a better spacing location out to space, but then they're going to catch it maybe in a slightly weird position and just adapt from there.
Yeah, and like I suppose it can work both ways. So like sometimes, like especially what I hear sometimes from like coaches with beginner players is that they can't use that variability because they don't have the fundamentals or like something like that. So what we'd actually do then is like we still encourage the variability. We want them to explore, but we kind of give the attacker more of an advantage. So we actually disadvantage the defender. Then as they get better, more confident, we could actually disadvantage the attacker. So it's kind of
exactly,
it's very important for the coach to kind of be aware of the skill levels and make sure that the tasks we're designing are suitable.
So true. Like that's actually before we hit the last kind of design principle. I think it's a good segment. Like we have coaches from NBA to under eights beginners, listening to the podcast. And I think these principles apply to every age group, like you just spoke about. And that's where I think you spoke about it earlier with task simplification. So as opposed, coaches, if we see players are struggling, as opposed to decomposing the task, aka we remove the key informational sources and we go back down to drills and technique work, we want, as Philip just spoke about, reduce complexity, make it more simple. So this could be maybe something I actually did very recently with younger players is in this closeout situation, I had the defenders holding a basketball. So it made it a little bit easier for the offense because, they weren't stealing the ball as much, but they could still block them with the ball. And there's lots more we can do.
Yeah, and like this is especially like really important for like if you're working with like young basketball players. So like you want to make sure that the ball they're using is suitable for them, that they're able to shoot. You want to make sure their ring height is at a suitable height. So like I suppose what's important for the coach is like you can identify what is stopping them from achieving success. So sometimes that could be the weight of the ball is too heavy for them to actually be able to shoot a 3-pointer. So we have to, I suppose, instead of using the size 4, we might use a size 3, and then suddenly you'll actually see they're able to do it, something like that. So
exactly,
it does, like these principles do apply to any skill level. It's just I suppose there's some subtleties that are important, and it's important for the coach to understand the skill level and then how you are going to simplify it. And then again, like if you're working with players that are really, really skillful, you might actually like disadvantage them, so they have to adapt. And like we're constantly looking for them to be able to adapt. So there you might put them in scenarios that they like we wouldn't task simplify, we might actually like make it more challenging by using variability and stuff like that. So yeah, that's a really important point, I think, as well.
Excellent. It's really interesting too, because that's the biggest difference with Europe and the US, where North America, it's mostly 10-foot hoops, size 7 balls from the immediate, as soon as kids start. Whereas in Europe, we do a far better job, lower hoops, ball size is proportionate to the age. And I think that's one of the biggest differences in why European players are generally thought of as being, more skilled. So last point, as we do this and we cover attentional focus, I'm going to try and think of an external cue in this closeout situation. But maybe Philip, you could just give us the briefing on what attentional focus is.
Yeah, this is actually something that, not that my opinion has changed on, but there's a brilliant paper that I read recently. It's by it's called Every Side is Two Stories, and it was talking about like how the ecological dynamics account of focus of attention. Because I suppose there's been a lot of research around focus of attention, but most of it was, I suppose, based from an information processing point. So, like when we're talking about focus of attention, I suppose if we're looking at it through an ecological dynamics lens, one, sometimes, well, basketball most of the time an external is going to be better. So external is when like the focus is away from our body, and we can either, I suppose, there can either be an external focus on our movements, but I think a lot of the benefits of an external focus of attention from an ecological point of view would be that they're attending to the key information, key affordances. So if your attention is on your body movements, you won't be looking at the affordance, or like your attention won't be able to focus on two things. So if we have our focus of attention away from our body externally, we're able to pick up the key information better. So that's, I suppose, sometimes the external focus of attention is seen as like, oh, it's for like, I suppose, the performance of the skill, but a lot of the time it's, I think it helps that we're able to pick up the information better, and then that enables us to perform the skill better.
Like an example that this morning, I had an under 14 group, mix of beginners, older players, and we started 20 minutes of different small-sided games, warm-up, mostly related to some, dribbling and passing. We weren't using the rims yet. And everything was obviously with an opponent. And it was very simple. It was things like dribble tag or dribble, I call it stay alive, where you have to stay alive in a small space and another defender's trying to steal it. And then we just manipulate the constraints. And then we added a passer. So it was like a 1-on-1 +1. They have to stay alive and then find where their teammate was and make a successful pass wherever they were. And naturally, what we saw after 20 minutes is at the beginning, players found it really difficult to dribble with their eyes up. And what they'd, traditionally be told is they'd do static dribbling 1-on-0. And the coach would say, put your head up, right? But we didn't even have to say that once, just because the design of the tasks, players were naturally looking and trying to take in information from their environment. I think, that's where it's like, I think if we're using these principles, we kind of like, external versus internal. Maybe feel free to challenge me, but I do feel like it's a little less important than the other ones, because we're not even necessarily, when we're using this well, we're not having to even talk about, techniques and things like that anyway.
Yeah. No, I do agree, especially like, I think if you have, like, I suppose, if you have the constraints manipulation nailed, you have the representative information and you have information movement coupling, I suppose a lot of it naturally would happen. But then I suppose it is really important for coaches to be aware of then that, like, if you had all that stuff set up and then you're like, make sure your elbow's at 90 degrees when you're shooting,
right?
it might be counterproductive. So
that's
like,
it.
Yeah, so it's not like, I do agree with what you're saying, but then I suppose it shows how nicely all the 5 principles are linked then.
Yeah,
Because
completely.
if you did that, then it would
absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that's a great point. And that's actually, I didn't even think about it. And that's more just because for me, I haven't done that for about 4 years. But now I think back when I started, I was doing small-sided games and correcting. So it makes complete sense. And then too, I guess it's different for every player. Like a nice external cue could be nice here and then. Like I had a player in an individual, well, not an individual, 2 players and me. And he was really struggling just shooting in our 2-on-1. And I gave him the cue, aim for a Brad. It stands for back, rim, and down. So as opposed to, correcting or doing anything, he just focused on his arc, self-organized naturally. He was way more successful. And that's where, I think it can resonate differently with different players.
Yeah. And I suppose that's like why I suppose our approach is very individualized, because even like the our instructions are going to act as a constraint.
Yeah,
And like I suppose that's quite important for coaches to understand. So like anything you say to the player is going to be a constraint. So then it's kind of, I suppose it is important to think about what you're saying, and does it align with the way that I'm coaching?
definitely. Look, Philip, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join today. I think I really enjoyed this episode because I think not just did we get the theory in, but it was so practical at the same time. So I hope that every single basketball coach out there listening to this signs up, to your skill acquisition course, which I can't wait to, take part in myself. How can coaches find out more information, follow your content, etc.?
Yeah, I suppose the best place is Twitter. My handle is like Mr. underscore tennis underscore coach. And then I tried to get a newsletter out every week. It's going to be every week from now on, but over the summer I was away, so it kind of ended up being every second week or something like that. And then what I'm working on at the moment is, it's going to be a free resource for coaches, because one of the most, I suppose, common questions I get is, where do I get started with the constraints-led approach? And what I wanted to be able to do was to kind of point towards, I suppose I could send them this, and I've tried to write it in a way that is accessible for coaches. I kind of sent it out to a few coaches, and I'm getting some feedback, which is good, because like around maybe like I've tried to simplify it as much as I can.
Right.
But they want, like, I suppose, examples in it. They want, I suppose, explanations of the key terms, things like that. So
Yeah.
I was hoping to have it done by the time I went back to school, but I'd say it'll be another maybe week or two before it's fully
Fantastic.
done. But hopefully as soon as possible. I'm
Oh,
trying to do
that'll
it.
be out by when this is released, so that's perfect timing, Philip.
Yeah.
I'll include that in the notes. And I've just exchanged the clay courts of northern Italy for the hard courts of East London. So
Yeah.
I have to do another one talking about more tennis. I play a lot, and it's just frustrating for me seeing still how, the things we're talking about today in basketball, it's not just unique to the basketball world, but these same kind of, I'd say, problems we're seeing in kind of all sports where, this dominant approach to coaching is just so different. I think that's why it's these ideas that, we share today, and, all the work you're doing. That's why I think it's so important. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for, I actually really enjoyed it too. It was nice to kind of talk through the principles in a practical way, and kind of, hopefully the coaches can take something away from it.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Philip.
Yeah, thanks, Alex.